right, cool. Hello, everybody. I think I'll get going. We are all pretty comfortable with Zoom these days, I think. We are being recorded, so we will make the recording available to you after the webinar. I'm Kate Lunsford. I am the Forest Issue Chair with the League of Women Voters of Washington. And we are really delighted that you came here tonight to hear about sustainable forestry in Washington State. The League of Women Voters of Washington advocates for the protection of all mature forests on state lands in Washington. And this webinar is one of a series of educational programs we're hosting to help us to understand all of the issues around forest management and to inspire local leagues to consider advocacy in their counties. And we'll hold another webinar soon to talk about some local plans. We are honored to have Dr. Paula Swedien with us to tell us about the work Conservation Northwest is doing in law and policy to help our state manage our granted forest lands with a balance of benefits to both the public and beneficiaries. So please keep yourself muted until the discussion and put your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time near the end of the hour to field your questions. And if we don't get to all the questions, we will follow up with you the best we can. Conservation Northwest expects state forest trust lands to benefit the public's interest in clean water, biodiversity, including the needs of endangered wildlife species, and climate mitigation, as well as trust beneficiaries. It was founded in Bellingham in 1989. It works closely with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, Department of Fish and Wildlife, forestry companies, and other organizations to promote ecological management and resilience on state forest lands, including state trust lands. Paula Swedien, PhD, is Conservation Northwest's Senior Policy Director and the point person at the state capitol. She represents Conservation Northwest on wildlife and wildlands policy issues, including wolf and marble murrelet conservation, and on forest policy, which includes a seat on the Carbon and Forest Management Work Group. Paula has worked on habitat conservation issues around the Pacific Northwest for 34 years. She worked for 12 years as a wildlife biologist and endangered species policy analyst with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and on Washington's Forest Practices Board from 2010 to 2020. Her recent work involves creating and applying funding mechanisms to shift forest management on state and private lands to support improved carbon sequestration and storage. Analyzing the conditions under which shifts to climate-smart forestry can become more socially and economically acceptable, and directing overlapping incentives to conserve habitat in key landscapes for wildlife habitat connectivity. Paula has a BS in biology from Indiana University, a master's of environmental studies and political science from Western Washington University, and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies with an emphasis on ecological economics from the Union Institute. Welcome, Dr. Swedien.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for all of you for showing up tonight. And I'm going to share my screen now and start my PowerPoint. It's great. It was great to be able to see you on screen a little bit before this started. And please definitely put your questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to leave plenty of time at the end of this PowerPoint so we can have more. I can try to answer your questions and we can have more back and forth discussion. So let me see. There we go. There's my starting slide. And thank you so much for the introduction, Kate. As Kate said, I have been working in the Pacific Northwest, specifically on forest conservation issues for about 34 years now. I've changed my seats around a little bit, but in all of that time, the through line has been trying to figure out how to apply the best tools and the best policy and the best persuasion to get federal, state, and private landowners to conserve core habitats for biodiversity and to manage lands that are more on the production end for carbon benefits and biodiversity benefits and for resilience. So that through line is going to come through in the presentation. So a little bit about Conservation Northwest. As Kate said, we were founded in 1989. Our main mission is to connect, protect, and restore wildlife and wildlands from the Washington coast to the British Columbia Rockies. So we work on large landscape conservation. And so that includes habitat protection, it includes trying to influence federal agencies on how they manage their lands, state agencies on how they manage their lands, and then trying to provide incentives for private landowners, both to protect core habitats, especially for endangered species, but for broader biodiversity, and then making sure that the areas between these core habitats are permeable and passable to wildlife that need to pass back and forth to meet their life history needs. So connectivity is a really big part of what we do. But we also focus very specifically on restoring critters that have been extirpated or their populations like really reduced in Washington state. So we work on wolves. Wolves came back on their own, but they need a lot of support, social support, especially to make sure that they are that coexistence among humans, especially humans that they can cause trouble with, is paid attention to, and that's very much a social endeavor, much more so than a wildlife biology endeavor. We have been behind the restoration of grizzly bears into the North Cascades, and finally got the final environmental impact statement signed off on in the federal government to get the wheels rolling to bring bears back into the North Cascades. There's probably a few of them wandering around there, but not enough to make a viable population. We have reintroduced Fisher into the Cascades and to the Olympics. We have helped wolverines make a comeback, and we are translocating lynx from British Columbia and Alberta onto the Colville Reservation in cooperation with the Colville tribe. So we do like to focus on the critters themselves. But as I'm sure all of you know, managing all sorts of land types and habitat types is essential to being able to make sure that our state's natural heritage and wildlife populations and plant biodiversity remains viable, in the face of climate change, in the face of development, in the face of increasing recreation pressures. So that's kind of the scope of what we work on. In the state land space, so here's a map of state lands, and all the stuff in pink is managed by DNR. And so most of what I'm going to talk about today is focused on the pink stuff that's in Western Washington. There's some really important lands in Eastern Washington as well, and we work not only on forests, but we work on the shrub steppe habitats as well. But like I said, I'm going to be focusing mostly on forest lands and in Western Washington. And there are about 2.4 million acres of forest that DNR manages overall, and about 1.5 million, 1.5, some people say 1.6 million acres of that in Western Washington. So the way our state lands program fits into our overall work is that we want to make sure that the best possible contributions of DNR state lands are being made to core habitat protections, and that especially is relevant for spotted owls, marbled murrelets, Canada lynx, sage grouse in the non-forested habitat, and like I said, general biodiversity, because there's literally over 1,000 species that are dependent on healthy forest ecosystems in Washington state. And like I said, we have connectivity programs, large landscape connectivity programs, Cascade to Olympics, our Eastern Washington Shrub Steppe program, and Cascades to Rockies. And then climate is a huge part of all of this. And so we want to make sure that forest lands are managed for carbon drawdown and resilience to the impacts of climate change going forward. So here's a picture of some of the critters that are dependent on forests in Washington state. Well, sage grouse aren't, but that are dependent on state lands. And so very specifically in Western Washington, the spotted owl, marble murrelet, and the long-legged myotis are all, forest and really older forest dependent species that we care about. So I'm going to go into a little bit of background now to try to kind of set the stage for the current issues that are really front and center for DNR state lands management in the forest landscape. So in 1997, the DNR completed a state lands habitat conservation plan. And I actually worked at DNR. That was my first job. And I helped write this. So I started there in 1993, 1994. And under the direction of Commissioner Jennifer Belcher, she really saw that the way DNR was handling the spotted owl issue, especially, was going to lead to, well, it was really expensive for them because they had to do surveys. Every timber sale that was in a potential spotted owl territory, they had to do surveys for, and that was really expensive. But they were also essentially doing timber sales kind of around the edges and had no landscape approach, and were kind of chasing the critter around the landscape, which was just going to lead to overall degradation and likely eventual extirpation of the species. And so Commissioner Belcher convened her executive management team and talked to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and said, I want to do a habitat conservation plan, and I want to do this, in a way where we can contribute ecologically significant amounts of habitat to support spotted owl populations, marble murrelet populations, and at the time, several salmon stocks were being listed by the National Marine Fisheries Service. So this is a map. It's just of one planning unit. This is the North Cascades planning unit, or the North Puget planning unit, sorry. And the stuff in green shows the lands that were designated to be managed for nesting, roosting, and foraging habitat for spotted owls under the Habitat Conservation Plan. And there's a little bit of stuff, I guess it's in purple, for dispersal habitat for spotted owls, but really the emphasis was on trying to shore up the habitats that were being managed by the U.S. Forest Service under the Northwest Forest Plan. And the reason that I'm wanting to emphasize a habitat conservation plan is twofold. One is that it ended up dedicating, and I'm not going to say set aside for total protection, because some of these lands can be managed, but it dedicated over 600,000 acres of West Side Forest to habitat conservation plan. So that's a combination of spotted owls. So you see there's 247,000 acres for spotted owl habitat management. And that includes some stuff on the east side, 272,000 acres for marble murrelet. There is some overlap between the owl and murrelet acres there, so that's not total. And there are 32,000 acres that were devoted just specifically to marble murrelets in their 2019 amendment to their HCP. But in total, 600,000 acres are devoted to owls, murrelets, riparian areas, and a few special habitats. And that is out of that, 1.5 million acres on the west side. And that's a pretty significant chunk. And so that sets some social and economic parameters or considerations that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the context of trying to conserve the remaining isolated stands of mature forests that are left that aren't protected by the HCP. But the other thing that's really important about this is that this is a significant contribution of land, and some of it's not habitat yet, but it is either being left alone to develop into habitat, or it is being targeted for restoration thinning in order to create structurally complex older forest. And there are representatives of the timber industry, especially the mill sector, who think that the HCP is overprotective, and that it was not necessary to designate so much land for the protection of endangered species in order to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And if they had their way, they would unravel this plan. And I am in, multiple work groups, multiple conversations with representatives from the American Forest Resource Council. That's kind of the trade group or the lobbying group for the mill sector. And I'm talking about this not to set them up as an enemy, because that's not super helpful, but they do have positions that put this plan under threat. And my experience in, working with forest activists is that the HCP is kind of in the background. It happened long enough ago that folks think it's kind of set in stone. It's essentially like the baseline of DNR management. But it is something that DNR can get out of if they want to. There would have to be an assessment of mitigation that they would still be required to provide if they got out of it. But that sort of drumbeat from the industry in combination with the recent Supreme Court ruling, it's called the Chevron ruling, which really allows the courts to make decisions at the expense of agency expertise. Those two things make me really nervous. And so, the outcomes of elections are really, really important. And the ability to defend the kinds of protections that are here for the long term for endangered species on state lands makes a huge difference. So for those two reasons, I just wanted to make sure people were, aware of and didn't forget the importance of this sort of backbone of DNR management. And now I'm going to switch to a little bit of Conservation Northwest history, and it will lead into the Supreme Court decision that sort of challenged the interpretation of the trust mandate. So in the mid to late 90s, DNR was starting to put up a lot of timber sales in the Loomis State Forest. And so Loomis State Forest, if you don't know, is like in sort of the central eastern part of Washington. It abuts the Pasayten Wilderness on the Forest Service land right to the west there. And parts of the Loomis State Forest are really, really important for lynx habitat. And DNR had management plans where they were going to transform essentially roadless areas into places that had a ton of roads, and they were going to harvest mature habitat that was really important for denning habitat for lynx. I mean, lynx do need some younger habitat for their prey species, for snowshoe hare that eat younger lodgepole pine that comes up over the snow, but they need a mosaic, and they also need relatively undisturbed habitat. And DNR was in the process of planning a bunch of timber sales. And so we sued them, and several other groups sued them. And part of the settlement was an agreement. So it was between my boss Mitch Friedman and Commissioner Belcher, that they gave us a certain amount of time for us to raise money to essentially buy these forest lands. And by buy them, it means like 100% compensate DNR's trust beneficiaries. And then they would put the land into a conservation status, into natural resource conservation areas. And so, we organized house parties. We talked to major donors. This was when there was a lot of like sort of new Microsoft money, where like sort of young computer programmers were becoming millionaires because of stock options they got for working for Microsoft, and they were like super into this kind of stuff. So we ended up raising $16.5 million, and were able to like right at the deadline, meet it and get the Board of Natural Resources to approve a transfer of this land from trust status, where there was pressure to log it for revenue for the trust beneficiaries. And we were able to get it into natural resource conservation status. So that was a huge deal. It was a watershed moment for us and for the state in a lot of ways. But it also raised the question of, why is it that sensible habitat management to ensure that important species remain on the landscape here in the state, why does that have to be like, why does the public have to buy that? And it started a series of conversations with legal experts and lawyers to take a look at the state's current legal interpretation of DNR's trust mandate. And some of you might be old pros at this and like really understand it, but if you don't, I mean, DNR was the state was granted lands at statehood, and the Constitution and the Enabling Act had a series of language that was traditionally interpreted that DNR needed to manage their lands to produce the maximum amount of revenue possible for named beneficiaries. And so these federally granted lands, those named beneficiaries are K through 12 schools, most of the universities, the public universities in Washington State, and then there's a few other smaller public, what we call federally granted trusts. There's another portion of DNR managed lands, about 560,000 acres, that are called state forest lands, and those are managed for income that specifically goes to counties. And so we were mostly focused on these federally granted lands, and really wanted a reinterpretation of a 1984 state Supreme Court case that talked about that DNR had essentially been interpreting as needing to manage for the most amount of revenue possible to those named beneficiaries within the context of their legal obligations. So the Habitat Conservation Plan was seen as a legal obligation, under the Endangered Species Act, but beyond that, it was like, we got to get as much timber out as possible. And we saw in this case and multiple cases where we wanted a somewhat more balanced approach, and we wanted a seat at the table. Conservation groups were really seen as kind of, gnats in the ear, or mosquitoes in the ear, and just kind of like, get out of here. You're not really a legitimate stakeholder at the table, because communities depend on this wood for keeping the mills open, and the beneficiaries depend on this money to build schools, and DNR staff is like really, really invested in their interpretation of the trust mandate. But it resulted in decisions that we saw as degrading to the environment and not taking a broader public interest into account. So we waited, and I want to give credit to my boss, Mitch Friedman, who was really sort of the architect of this. And then we also worked with Peter Goldman, long-term attorney, public forest interest attorney in Washington State. And we kept looking for opportunities to file a lawsuit that would really, really illustrate the need to get clarification from the state Supreme Court about how the trust mandate was interpreted. And so there were several kind of false starts or attempts over the years, over about a 20-year period. But finally in 2019, with the completion of a sustainable harvest calculation decision by DNR, and sustainable harvest calculation, just for, I hope I'm not like being too technical, and please put questions in the chat if you need to, but DNR is required by law to every 10 years calculate the amount of timber that they can harvest. So the beneficiaries and the mills can plan on how much lumber is going to come off of, or how much timber is going to come off of DNR lands. And that's in state law, that they're required to calculate that every 10 years. So they were doing a new one in 2019. And at the same time, they were finalizing a long-term conservation strategy for the marble murrelet, which was an amendment to their habitat conservation plan, because when the HCP was originally completed in 1997, we didn't have enough information. And we needed to do a whole bunch of studies. So there was an interim strategy. And so finally in 2019, there was a final decision. And so we prepared for bringing a lawsuit against DNR and saying that they did not give adequate consideration to broader public interests in these decisions. But we also had a really important consideration in that we did not want to be, and this isn't just optics. I mean, this is true, that we did not want to be the aggressors in an environment where there was a lot of rural communities who felt like DNR wasn't cutting enough. But we were relatively sure, based on all the Board of Natural Resources meetings and all the conversations that we were having around the Marble Murrelet long-term strategy, that the industry and some of the counties that are pretty dependent on timber revenue were going to sue, and that they were going to specifically sue on interpretation of the trust mandate. And so we prepared ourselves to be ready just in case. And so sure enough, American Forest Resource Council and several counties sued DNR, on trust interpretation issues. And we had our counter lawsuit ready that we filed, later that same day. So, one can quibble about whether or not we achieved our optic, goals there, but we were ready, and the industry did file first. So long story short, the case got filed in January of 2020, and it went to Superior Court. We lost at Superior Court. We expected to lose at Superior Court, and then the normal route would have been it would go to the appeals court. But we wanted an expedited ruling because we thought it was really important. So we petitioned the state Supreme Court, and they agreed, and they took up the case, and the decision came out on July 21st, 2022. So the basis of our argument is that in the state constitution, when they're talking about these lands that got granted to DNR, the language actually says all the public lands granted to the state are held in trust for all the people. And that one sentence, in conjunction with some language in the Enabling Act and other court case interpretation, and if anybody's like a super legal geek or wants to like really dig into this, I'm happy to provide like more background information. So feel free to contact me. But our attorneys were able to argue that at the very least, DNR should not interpret this language as the trust beneficiaries having being sort of the sole beneficiaries, and that in order to meet sort of common trust law, that DNR had to actually maximize revenue. There's other ways to meet the obligation from a trust to a trustee without pedal to the metal, essentially. And so what we got in this Supreme Court ruling, three really important things. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that DNR is not required to maximize revenue. They did clarify that they do have a duty to provide some support to the enumerated beneficiaries. So all the folks that I talked about, the common schools and the University of Washington and Washington State and the normal schools, that's Western Washington and Central Washington. But that DNR also had a broader obligation to the public, and those two things should be construed in harmony. So that was huge. It was a huge ruling. And then the final thing was that DNR is not obligated to log forests as a sole means of generating revenue on forest lands, and that you could actually consider non-monetary benefits to the named beneficiaries, in addition to taking into account broader public interests. So the bottom line is that DNR has broad discretion to manage its lands, both for beneficiary benefit and for the public interest. So the trick is, however, that DNR doesn't really know what their operating space is. So they've got this discretion. They argue, and this is, the decision was written in such a way that everyone could interpret that they won. So the industry feels like they won because it validated that DNR has a duty to generate revenue for the named beneficiaries. DNR says that they won because that they never said that they had to maximize revenue. But as a former DNR employee, I know that that is not true. And as someone who has sat in multiple meetings trying to argue for somewhat more conservation oriented policies, I've heard staff over, a good 20 years say, but, we can't do that because we need to provide this income to the trust beneficiaries. We can't, pay more attention to steep and unstable slopes. We can't pay attention to watershed quality the way you want us to, or we can't leave as many big trees as you want us to in Eastern Washington while we're doing forest health treatments because we need to pay for them. And all of these things, I mean, it's like imbued in DNR culture. But once this ruling came out, they're like, oh yeah, we always knew that. We always knew that we did not have to maximize revenue. And so what we are left with is needing to figure out a way to test this ruling and slowly change the culture of DNR over time, because DNR employees, and especially the ones who work in the silviculture and forestry divisions, it's kind of an article of pride for them. And again, I'm not saying this in a derogatory way at all. I mean, they feel a huge sense of purpose in being able to provide revenue for schools and being able to provide revenue for rural counties. And it's really, really important to them. And so the idea that this Supreme Court ruling would flip a switch overnight is just not true. And so those of us who want to see DNR change fundamentally and institutionally sort of have a responsibility to figure out how to do it in a way that is not overly disruptive, in a way that is not going to cause backlash, and in a way that allows for the institution and the communities dependent on current levels of logging to adapt to this broader interpretation. So that's kind of where we are with that lawsuit. And I also want to say that the Washington Conservation Action and the Olympic Forest Coalition were our major organizational partners in this lawsuit. And then there were several individuals that also joined, and they had great sort of testimony and stories about why state lands were important to them. So it was very much a group effort. And so now I'm going to switch to this topic of structurally complex older forest, or what some folks call legacy forests. And so one of the, I would say, unintended consequences of the Habitat Conservation Plan is that there are stands of forest on DNR that aren't necessarily part of larger landscapes that were identified for conservation for spotted owls or for marbled murrelets, or part of riparian corridors or steep and unstable slopes, that are kind of in this in-between stage. They're not plantations, and they are not and they're not quite old growth. So DNR does have policy where they do not cut old growth according to a certain definition. And, sometimes there's arguments about that definition, but by and large, they don't cut old growth based on policy. But there are forests that were either lightly logged or they regenerated after fire, and they have a lot of complexity. They have large legacy trees, like legacy trees, meaning trees left over from the prior stand. So they're larger than the main cohort of trees that's growing. And these are like really important islands of biodiversity in a landscape that's otherwise been transformed from from old growth to more simply structured and fewer species timber plantations. And there were a couple of groups, so the Center for Responsible Forestry and now the Legacy Forest Defense Fund. So a guy by the name of Stephen Kropp was really the person who brought this to the fore and did a bunch of grassroots organizing. And so both of those organizations now are they're doing amazing work, and you probably know these folks, but I just want to acknowledge that I feel like they are responsible for sort of energizing grassroots activists to really pay attention to DNR lands. And for the amount of time that I have been working on forestry issues, both in the regulatory arena on the Forest Practices Board and on DNR issues, sometimes there were just a few of us, right? And we felt kind of lonely. And now there's like this massive amount of like great grassroots energy and attention. And I really do want to give public credit to Stephen for working on this, and now the folks that that also are part of the Center for Responsible Forestry. So if any of you are associated with them or know them, just want to make sure that they know about this shout out. So Stephen did a bunch of analysis to, and he's like very technically savvy, and he used LiDAR data and in combination with DNR's inventory data, and he developed essentially a screening tool that showed there's about 77,000 acres of forests that are potentially what we now call structurally complex, mature, carbon-dense forests on DNR lands that are not otherwise protected, and that there's timber sales going up in a lot of this stuff. And so this map kind of shows where this is distributed, but the map shows both a combination of these forests that are protected and non-protected. But you can kind of see from the pattern that there are a lot of like smaller stands, and that poses some challenges to try to protect. But overall, if there are these older forests in islands of plantations, it's really important for local plant biodiversity, and the carbon stocks are much higher than average. So if you take into account the soil carbon in addition to the above ground carbon, most of these forests or these forests average about 200 tons of carbon per acre. And regular managed forests on DNR land are more around 50 or 60, or definitely below 100. So harvesting these forests, and this graph is from a paper by Bev Law and colleagues, and it's based on really good forest carbon process dynamics in forest. And so the green line shows the carbon accumulation from these unharvested older forests. The yellow dotted line shows what the carbon dynamics are like after harvest, and then taking into account where some carbon goes into to long-lived wood products, or sort of more durable wood products, and then the forest regrows. But you never, the point of this graph is that you never really make up for the emissions from logging these older forests when you transform them essentially into plantations and wood products. And it's like, so that's the key here. And so we calculated that there were about 35 million metric tons of CO2 that would be emitted and stay in the atmosphere over a 100-year period if all of those 77,000 acres got harvested. And that's a big deal. That is around 5% of the total emissions that we want to be reduced by 2050 under our Climate Commitment Act. And CO2 is a very long-lived gas in the atmosphere. It doesn't cycle out completely cycle out for thousands of years. And so it's really sort of important to keep these carbon stocks like in situ on the land. So what are some strategies for protecting these older forests? So there's several strategies that have been deployed. Some of them have been, just trying to negotiate with DNR. Lots of activists show up at Board of Natural Resources meetings. There have been lawsuits on individual timber sales. But the thing that we used that sort of broke through was using money that was generated through the Climate Commitment Act and put into the Natural Climate Solutions account. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, Climate Commitment Act was passed in 2021. It's a state cap and trade system. It charges large emitters of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. They have to buy permits at auction. And they don't have to necessarily buy all of their permits. And there are some large polluters that get excused from this because they're exposed to competition from international trade. But by and large, there's a significant amount of revenue that's generated from auctioning off these permits. And the law puts the revenue from auctioning off the pollution permits that the polluters have to buy into 3 different accounts. And so one account goes to essentially greening our transportation system and making it more climate friendly through a number of activities. A second account is investing in essentially the hard infrastructure or gray infrastructure, and clean energy, and helping frontline communities adapt, and also helping workers in the fossil fuel industry find new jobs. So that's kind of the second bucket. And the third bucket is natural climate solutions account. And I worked hard, like starting from 2013, when Governor Inslee first started trying to get climate legislation passed, to make sure that there was language where money could be spent on acquiring forest land, in either acquiring forest land or putting conservation easements on it, that would change its management trajectory towards higher carbon stocks. And so there's multiple other ways that that money can be spent, but forest sequestration is a big part of it. And so a coalition of us worked really hard in the 2023 legislative session, which was the first year we could spend that money, on trying to protect some of these legacy forests. And our original proposal was for much more than the 2,000 acres. But just the makeup of the legislature and who has power and who's chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and the influence of essentially of the timber industry on that person and people that had power in the Ways and Means Committee. So our proposal, which was for 8,000 acres originally, got whittled down to 2,000 acres, but we could have not gotten anything. And so it was a great start. And so we essentially got $70 million of Natural Climate Solutions Fund in the 2023 session, and we got an additional $15 million in the 2024 session to protect a total of 2,273 acres of these structurally complex older forests. So that money is going to protect those lands in situ, and prevent carbon emissions from occurring from harvesting it, and also all the habitat and biodiversity benefits. But kind of a unsung or hidden benefit of this is that so DNR is required to purchase replacement lands. And so this is another complete compensation of the trust beneficiaries. And I'll talk about other strategies to protect it in a minute. But one of the benefits of this is that the value of these older forest stands is really high, because there are still some specialty mills that need the larger trees. And so those stands appraise out around $20,000 an acre, which is really high. But when DNR goes to buy replacement land, that replacement land they can get at somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 an acre. So they're essentially getting 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 number of acres that are coming into trust management as working forests. But the language of the proviso requires that those working forests still be managed for increased sequestration and a climate benefit. So it's not business as usual. And the land that's being acquired, and so this map is of a big land transaction that happened last December, where DNR was able to acquire lands that a large industrial landowner, a timber investment management organization who had been managing on short rotations, or essentially a liquidation cycle, which is very suboptimal from a carbon perspective. DNR was able to acquire about 9,000 acres of this. And so that 9,000 acres is now going to be managed in a way that will, relatively speaking to the way the land was managed before, increase carbon sequestration. So it's kind of a double benefit. You're protecting the older forest and keeping those carbon stocks on site, and then using that money essentially to get land out of private management that would otherwise store a lower level of carbon, and get it into, it's still working forest, but it's going to be managed in a way where the carbon stocks are going to be higher. And so that's awesome. And this is only, they spent about 48 million of the 70 million on this particular transaction. And so we are hoping to see them purchase land kind of like this with the additional like $22 million or so that they have. And I see that I, as usual, am taking a little longer to talk about this stuff than I thought I was going to. So anyway, I'm just gonna wrap up in a few minutes. So there are other strategies for protecting this older forest. One is getting the Board of Natural Resources to create a policy where they just say, we're not gonna harvest this. And then they adjust their sustainable harvest calculation to take that into account. And you know, we would see when they did that, if that sort of reduced the overall amount of volume, but that is one way to go about it, where essentially the corpus of the trust takes the cost of not harvesting that and shifts around their harvest plans to take it into account. So the public doesn't have to buy it, because we're not going to be able to use that other strategy. If we were going to use that legislative complete buyout strategy, it'd be over $1 billion to buy out all of that. And that's about the amount that the Natural Climate Solutions Fund, has generated so far. And there's a ton of other uses for that money. And so we're not likely to compete for it. And it would also take too long. And a lot of it would be harvested by that point. So we need some other approaches. So one is this policy in front of the Board of Natural Resources. And, that requires a lot of politicking and trying to convince them that this is a good thing. It requires leadership from the Commissioner of Public Lands, which has been somewhat lacking in order to create this policy so far. And then we can also look to continuing this attempt to add to DNR's land base. So the beneficiaries whose land aren't being harvested by not harvesting this older forest get additional opportunities for working harvest or for working forest, but it's not necessarily like a one-to-one trade. And based on the Supreme Court ruling, it would be really nice to be able to transmit and understand, get the decision makers to understand that the public benefits of these forests are essentially part of what was meant by that Supreme Court ruling, that they have broad flexibility, that they don't have to maximize revenue, and that they can manage for public benefit. And the public benefits of not cutting these forests can be like clearly articulated. So that's another way to go about it. And then there has been discussion of carbon offset projects. DNR tried to do one. They tried to lease their land for carbon, or at least start the process. They got sued by the timber industry. We intervened, along with a couple of other groups. We got a favorable ruling at the Superior Court level, but it is being appealed. So we'll see what happens. And so it's a little bit uncertain how much the carbon offset strategy could be used. So bigger picture considerations for like looking at all of DNR lands. So these unprotected mature West Side older forests are only 5% of DNR's forest land base. So what about the rest of it? So Conservation Northwest, in really close partnership with Washington Conservation Action, has been working on analyses and policy proposals to try to implement what's called climate smart active management. So it's restoring plantations and essentially lengthening the cutting cycle or the rotation length. And then, there's just the industry really feels like their back's against the wall. They are having a hard time getting enough supply for their mills. And these are serious considerations. I mean, they're things that we can't blow off or say, that they shouldn't be worried about them, and that, our interests should be, more important than their interests. But, they are a powerful block. And when they feel like their back's against the wall, it makes it tricky, as both at the Board of Natural Resources level and in the legislature, to try to protect as much forest as we want to. So coming up with strategies to help them stay whole, to keep them from going out of business, to try to reduce that backlash, and try to not have these actions either be perceived to or actually cause harm to the mill sector. Like, that's an important consideration. And then for the lands where the counties are the beneficiaries, we need to work on decoupling logging from the revenue for county services. So a lot of these counties they get money from logging. And so like in 2022, which was the last annual report that DNR had, logging on state forest lands produced $56 million of revenue to rural counties. And that's huge. And they buy fire trucks and ambulances and help fund their hospitals and pave their roads and, supplement income for rural schools, and pay for their libraries. And like, those are real things. And so to just suggest that we shouldn't worry about a reduction in income from a shift in how DNR managed lands are logged is not paying attention to this sort of broader social context. So those things are really important. I am going to end here in just a minute by saying that one of the things that we've been working on is trying to model how you can lengthen rotations and do it in a way where you don't reduce the total amount of volume coming off of DNR lands. And this graph shows a modeling configuration where we transition from a 40-year rotation to an 80-year rotation. And this is showing the increase in overall carbon stocks on DNR lands. And so this is change. This isn't absolute amounts. And so that transition was significant. I mean, 60 million metric tons of CO2 over 70 years, more of it in the forest, some of it in wood products, as a result of going to an 80-year rotation. And then this is showing timber volume coming off. So the other constraint that we put on the model was trying to, so at that first period, that 450 million board feet, that's about what DNR is supposed to harvest on a annual basis in their current sustainable harvest calculation. I think they're harvesting a little bit less, but we didn't want that to go below. But we showed that if you vastly increase the amount of commercial thinning you do on DNR lands, you can transition, and at the end of the 70 years, you actually have more volume to harvest. You're clear cutting less, so that's about the blue bar is the amount of timber they're getting from final harvest, and that includes leaf trees, but that amount comes from about half the acres because you get more volume per acre on an 80-year rotation than you do on a 40-year rotation. So you're reducing the acres that are clear cut at any one time. You're reducing road density, and the opportunity to do all this thinning also provides the opportunity to reintroduce structural complexity and resilience into the stands. So I have some more slides, but I'm going to stop there because we're 7 minutes from the end and I want to make sure we can answer some questions. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. Thanks so much. And did I understand that you might be able to stay past 8 o'clock a little bit?
Oh, sure.
People are
Yeah,
still
absolutely.
here, but
Absolutely.
let's get to it. Valerie is going to help me field some of these questions. Why don't you go ahead, Valerie?
And
Awesome.
just to make sure, did I stop sharing screen?
You did.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So looking through the questions in the chat, a lot of the material that there were questions about have been covered in your presentation as we went through. I think one of the questions that came up a couple times that piqued my interest especially was the question around industry and their work with DNR. So you'd mentioned that there was insufficient supply for the mills, and then also there was the question around the production of wood pellets being a functional use for wood products. And I wondered if you might look into that a little for us.
Yeah, let's see. So if I just want to make sure I understand the question correctly. Just I had made a statement about in the mill sector being worried about inadequate supply, right? And so it was about is that true, or what can you do about it? Or I just want to make sure I'm addressing it correctly.
Yeah, sorry for being vague.
Okay.
Yeah, I was curious about the I'm not forming that correctly. I was curious if the industry complaints about insufficient supply from the forestry is going to hold weight against possible reimbursement from Climate Commitment Act.
So, so right now there's a forest carbon work group that was created by the same budget legislation that that provided the money to protect those older forests. And there was money to hire some economists to do a wood supply study. And so that is ongoing right now. And so one of the really, so preliminary results were just presented to us a couple days ago, or maybe it was just yesterday. It was just yesterday. Were you on that, David? Did you listen? Yeah. So, so one of the really interesting things that came out of that is that all harvest on DNR lands is only about 9% of all of the harvest on private lands. And so I think the supply crunch is a result of heavy harvest on private lands. And so they've got essentially a distribution of younger age classes. And it does produce some concern about like any land you take offline from DNR could contribute, especially to the specialty mills that need larger logs. But at the same time, it also, this report provides fodder for the argument that the shorter your rotation, like the less fiber you produce, essentially. So it does provide some justification for you know, slowly increasing rotation ages over time. And then the other thing that I hope will sort out in this work group, and the work group is intended to provide some policy recommendations to the legislation. But you know, we found this in that model I was just showing you at the end, is that DNR doesn't thin that much. They have a lot of lands that have commercial sized logs, but they can't get to it because thinning is more expensive than clear cutting. And DNR only gets 25 cents on the dollar. So every time they sell a timber sale, 75% of it goes to the trust beneficiaries and 25% of it goes to run the agency. And so they're kind of running out, or they have limited resources. And so if they have so many dollars to spend to produce so much volume, then they're going to go to a clear cut rather than thinning. And so they thin about 1,000 to 1,200 acres a year, and they clear cut like 10 to 12,000 acres a year. And so if the legislature were to, and in 2023, I proposed and got legislative support for a proviso that gave them an additional $10 million to thin in some of those spotted owl areas that are supposed to be habitat, but aren't yet. You know, they're like, you know, overstocked, structurally simple stands that need to be thinned in order to create spotted owl habitat. Well, you can get commercial logs out of that. So essentially, there is more supply. We might, on DNR land, we might just need some money to unlock it, and then that supply can be delivered in a responsible way by doing variable density thinning and just sort of improved silviculture. So industry will make that argument, but I think that there's ways to address it in a, you know, in a reasonable way.
Excellent. Thank you for your cogent answer to my vague question. I think that I would love to see how we can do some policy forward thinking in that area. I think it really addresses the concerns on both sides. Like, how can we preserve habitat at the same time that we provide for industry in necessary ways? So then Sherry Dysart asked a question that from one of your first slides, one that many of us have seen before, about the research that shows that sorry, reading the question. The research shows that there's cutting trees is actually good for the climate, versus the slide that you've shown us that demonstrates that the carbon reserves held in the forests are of more worth. So we're curious, is there work being done in order to adopt a modification to that perception, and also to the legislative language supporting that position?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of work. I mean, that's a huge, I mean, so my experience in this forest carbon working group is that the industry representatives continue to maintain that position that shorter rotations are, so cutting trees on shorter cycles and replacing older forests with young plantations is better for the climate. And so my sense is, just from understanding forest modeling dynamics, is that the exercises that we're going to be doing with it, that we've hired consultants within that group to do, are going to show something different. And then the modeling results that that I showed towards the end there, we're doing a refined model, because it was just kind of it was an exploratory thing, and we're doing a fancier version, and hopefully we'll get results soon. And then I have a large literature review, and I'm working with colleagues to try to figure out ways to get that message out, and certainly talk to legislators, and maybe organize work groups in front of the legislatures that bring the scientists in. So I have some credibility, but I work for a conservation organization, and legislators are going to be they are likely to be more convinced by an academic that doesn't work for a conservation organization, just like they should be more convinced by an academic instead of someone who is paid by the timber industry. But they tend to be quite convinced by people who work for the timber industry. So we haven't quite figured out that dynamic, but there is a lot of work going on to try to dispel. And I think, like I know, Kate, that you asked me the question about, there was a report that AFRC commissioned from a subset of University of Washington, and it was like a case study on an older forest stand on DNR land, and they showed in that study that you get more carbon benefits from cutting that forest and turning it into wood products and turning it into a plantation. But their assumptions were laughable. I mean, seriously, just not even defensible. And if they had tried to get that report published in an academic journal, there's no way it would make it, just because the assumptions were so wrong. And so some of the assumptions were that carbon sequestration stopped, not just that the rate slowed down, but it like in an absolute sense stopped at 80 years, which is demonstrably not true. They like double, triple, quadruple counted the substitution benefit. So that, the idea that if you build a building with wood instead of steel or concrete, that there's a carbon savings there. They just like that, they counted that benefit multiple times when it should only be counted once. They undercounted the emissions from logging slash, that when you log something, like there's a bunch of stuff left over on the ground, and you disturb the soil, and you like knock down snags and break up woody debris, and only 40 to 50% of the carbon that is in a standing forest, in a forest ecosystem, gets transferred to a mill, and then then the amount gets reduced further into a wood product. But the decay of the on-site stuff, they underestimated that, and so their decay factors were lower than necessary. And so if you add all that stuff up, it's I mean, you can easily poke holes in that study, and I think it's a bit of a sign of their desperation, that they're putting out such poor material. But anyway, to end that answer, there's a lot of efforts going on to attempt to get out in the public sphere what the real science says.
Thank you for that answer. I want to call out that we are at 8:04. You'd agreed to stay a little bit longer. I'm thinking maybe 3 questions. Does that sound doable?
That's fine. I'm good like till 8:30. I mean, I don't know how
Okay.
long other people want to stay, but I'm fine. So
Well,
yeah.
the chat is lively, so we could probably keep you busy until so David Perk asks, and I'll broaden the question a little bit. In your view, has Superintendent Rakedahl made progress decoupling the Common School Trust from timber harvest? And then we can also talk about smaller legislative districts and also counties.
Okay. Yeah. So Superintendent Rakedahl has been like an amazing voice for talking about how the amount of money that K through 12 schools get for their construction fund from logging DNR lands is minuscule compared to the need. And that's a really important, and he's made public statements at the Board of Natural Resources to say, we should really think about changing management and is probably much more beneficial to direct the benefits of management towards, towards climate change and wildlife habitat and water quality. I mean, he's been like a really strong voice. I'm not sure that he has made, well, and then I would also say that he has sometimes been like the only vote, or maybe there's one other person that's voted with him on particular older forest timber sales to say like, I object to this sale. But I haven't seen an effective policy mechanism yet where those things are decoupled. He's trying, but it's a difficult thing to do. And one can hope. So if he had a better partner as a lands commissioner, they could probably come up with some really good policies and kind of try to figure that out. But that hasn't been the case so far. So we'll see what happens.
And then there's a variety of questions around ways that the Climate Commitment Act reimbursement could possibly be broadened in policy to encourage better land management.
Yeah. So that's definitely my colleague Rachel Baker from Washington Conservation Action and I both want to see some of that money used to help pay for longer rotations. So in order for DNR to make that transition, so I talked about how thinning is more expensive for them. They will probably need some supplemental funding in order to be able to accomplish all that thinning. In order to achieve those lengthened rotations, like in a way that's politically acceptable. I mean, you can lengthen rotations in a way that doesn't require like all that additional thinning management, but it will cause a pretty drastic reduction in overall timber volume for a few decades. And that is not likely going to be something that the legislature is going to accept or fund, or the Board of Natural Resources would approve. And I do want to put a plug or just state sort of my personal philosophy, and I think it's my organization's philosophy as well, is that the timber industry is important. I mean, as much as like institutionally their politics and their practices can be really frustrating. And that, there's all sorts of reasons why jobs have declined within the industry over years. And a lot of that just has to do with global competition. It has to do with automation, all of these things. But there's still, I think the latest best data I have is like 34,000 jobs that are associated with the timber industry. And so that's, if you're an economics geek, that's direct, indirect, and induced jobs. So and that's, that may not sound like a lot statewide, and it's gone down over time. But if you are currently employed in that industry, and that's an important job for your family, and that's an important job for your community, I think we as conservationists, environmentalists are really well served to try to help those people keep their jobs. I mean, there are ways to do forestry that are more labor intensive and that can keep people working. And there's smaller scale mills that don't require the level of capitalization. And so like thinking about how to localize the wood basket. So Jefferson County is doing some really awesome work on that. They've hired a consulting forester who thinks a lot about that. And Heidi Eisenhower thinks a lot about that, is like how do we humanize the scale of this so we're not sort of at the mercy of large international capital, essentially, which is going to drive towards efficiency from the perspective of the highest level of profit for the lowest level of cost, which means reducing labor. And so that's why people have been that's why there's fewer and fewer people employed in the industry. But the people who are still there, like, that's important. It's important culturally, it's important to their communities. And from working in the legislature over the last 8 to 10 years, like directly as a lobbyist. I mean, I worked sort of as an analyst prior to that, but have been a lobbyist for the last 8 years. The industry has an enormous amount of empathy and sympathy from legislators across the board, Democrats, Republicans. And so when our community comes in and proposes things that either are or can be framed as harming forest related jobs in rural communities, we always lose. And so we have to come up with ways where we can accomplish our forest management goals, our resilience goals, our climate goals in a way that doesn't throw people out of work. I mean, that's just essential. We're not going to be successful if we can't do that. Did I like really go off the rails on your question there?
No, it was glorious. I'm all inspired now. I'll try and stay to the chat and not come up with my own questions. So another question, this one goes to the thinning, which is an interesting question. According to Western watersheds, exposing the forest floor to increased sunlight actually can increase the ability for a wildfire to ignite. And so there's some question around if forest thinning is a good approach in some.
Yeah, I mean, it's all context specific. So Western Washington forests aren't anywhere near as prone to fire as Eastern Washington forests. And so Western watersheds, I think, works more in the context of more dry forest ecosystems, where overly intensive thinning is a problem, and that can be done like sort of in the name of forest health. And it can be too much. And so that condition is definitely worth thinking about. In Western Washington forests, there are ways to do thinning that don't overly expose, don't overly dry out the forest or overly expose it to conditions that increase fire risk. And then there are quite a few studies that show that a plantation stand is essentially a condition for contagion, and contagion can be fire, contagion can be disease, but you've got closely spaced trees. They're kind of all the same. They're the same size. They're the same species. There's no place for like a bad event to stop, essentially. But forests that are naturally complex are more fire resilient, and this is even on the west side. They retain more water. They're more efficient at getting nutrients out of the soil, like the different tree sizes, the different species. They keep the mycorrhizal fungi and that whole soil ecosystem intact. And so the kind of thinning that I have in mind and I'm talking about isn't just like even spacing and perpetuating a plantation in order to maximize growth. It's to reintroduce the kind of complexity the natural forests have. And you can still treat that forest, in a way where you get commercial products out of it, but you're leaving the forests in a, either if you're starting from a plantation and you're trying to restore it, you're leaving it in a better condition, or you're leaving it in a way that is more resilient to fire and all these other things.
Thank you for that. It's very specific to the area. And then from what you were saying earlier, I was inspired to ask you if there's a champion for forests in either the Senate or Congress and at the federal level. And Marty added that in the 2020 bill on forest products. Oh, Marty, that's a state bill, sorry. So I was just curious if there's someone on the federal level who's been a real champion for balancing industry against forestry practices.
Not really. I mean, we
Okay.
really have someone that's taken that on. I mean, sometimes Senator Cantwell has kind of been in that camp, but she's a little inconsistent. She's been a little inconsistent. And I'm not to say she's damaging, but sometimes she's helpful and sometimes she's neutral. But Congress doesn't. And so if the question is like sort of related to federal forest management.
Oh, mostly because I was thinking about it in an industry-wide level. We're doing a lot of work currently along climate in order to figure out how to handle the turnover in carbon-heavy industries like coal. So we're also doing that for forestry. And so I was curious if there's something that you've seen on the federal level that's working holistically to address that segment of the industry.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything. I mean, and
Okay.
it might be, I mean, I work a little on the federal level, but not as much as I do on the state level. So I might be missing something. But I am not aware of anything.
Okay. That was my own question. Sorry. I'm going back to the chat now.
Yeah.
So Janine asks if Conservation Northwest unequivocally supports the immediate ceasing of logging on legacy and complex forests.
Yes, yeah, we do. And my only caveat there is that we have to sort of agree on a definition. And to like to be able to like find these things. And there are some like I was just looking at Legacy Forest Defense Fund's website today, and they claim there's 112,000 acres of legacy forest or structurally complex older forest, and I think that's an overestimate. I'm not quite sure where that number came from. I emailed Stephen to kind of try to get clarification, and I haven't gotten that clarification yet. But I think to say immediate cessation of logging on 112,000 acres of those forests is like, that's not tenable. And that would kind of break DNR. And so we would need to phase something in, but I have a feeling that some of those acres include stuff that is probably on the older end, but isn't complex yet and could be made complex by thinning. And I would not put that in a immediate cessation. So there is like, again, I'm working on this forest carbon work group, and working with DNR to get data. They gave us data saying there's about 66,000 acres of forest that are 80 years old or older, sort of regardless of kind of complexity condition. And we're using that as a surrogate in the modeling because we had a hard time using their characteristics from their inventory data to like really nail down a good definition for modeling. So we're using age as a surrogate, and they say there's like 66,000 acres in areas that are not otherwise reserved from harvest or reserved from, from clear cut type harvest, on West Side DNR lands. And so, even if all of that was legacy forest, I mean, if all of that was legacy forest, we'd be cool with that, with not logging it and figuring out something else. Cause I don't think that's that big an impact. I think you can figure out a combination of acquiring more DNR land and doing more thinning and then lengthening rotations to over time, like make up that volume. So yeah, so my only caveat is that there's a pretty clear definition, and then the current forest condition is actually structurally complex, older, carbon dense, and not something that's on its way to there, because that category is sort of already on its way to old growth. And we would be accused of sort of just continuing to grab more and more forest to say that we don't want it logged. And I don't think that that's a helpful position to be in. But the stuff that's like really structurally complex older forest, then yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to say we don't need to log it, and there's ways to mitigate the impact of that.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's encouraging to see views coalescing on a definition of legacy forest that seems to fit in most voices. So Nicole asks, how are tribal voices being incorporated into the process?
That is a great question. Thank you, Nicole, for asking that. So we consult with our tribal partners all the time on this. And sometimes we hear that like this is a priority for the tribes we talk to, and other times they're like, there are other things that are more important to us. And so we just try to balance it out. One of the things that we heard on the legislative proposal from this last year was that there was some concern that if there was a particular timber sale or particular stand that was proposed to be protected in the 2024 supplemental budget, and there was a tribe or like we want to make sure that if that gets put into an NRCA status or, you know, a conservation status, that we still have access to the land. So like, that's one of the biggest things we've heard from tribes, is that the conservation of these forests it themselves isn't the issue, but making sure that they continue to have access for cultural resources and for traditional food gathering, and that they're not sort of locked out of the land should it change from a regular trust status to a conservation status. And so, you know, we completely support that. That's super important.
That's a really good point. Thank you for making it. And then Christy asks a question that is just about perfect for wrapping us up. And then so Christy asks, for us small neighborhood groups on the edge of burnout in our fight for legacy forests, as a long-term advocate, what advice do you have? Can you be our cheerleader?
So first of all, thank you for all of your work and for being a strong advocate for this. And so, you know, I guess the advice I have is take care of yourself. You know, remember that you're not alone. In fact, you're part of a growing movement. You know, take breaks. But you know, to continue to tell your story. And you know, one of the most effective shifts I've seen is that when a particular county hears from their residents that this is important to them. So working your county commission is super important. And then if your county commission says, yeah, I'd like to do this, but you know, where am I going to get replacement for library funds or whatever, is that you work with them on the issues that they raise that are sort of practical and financial. But you know, I've worked with WASAC, with Washington Association of Counties, and a guy by the name of Paul Jewell is their current, he's their natural resources director. And I first met Paul on, DNR had this thing called the Solutions Table, where they were trying to figure out how to do additional murrelet conservation above and beyond what they were going to do through their HCP amendment. And, you know, Paul's a moderate Republican. He used to be a county commissioner in Kittitas County. And, you know, he was pretty skeptical of me, a little bit standoffish. But as we were going through the Solutions Table process, and we were you know, kind of finding some common ground. And I especially was saying, well, you know, like, tell me more about what is it that limits county governments from doing what they need to in terms of you know, providing services, and just like asking that question and just listening to him, and then trying to come up with proposals where we could all get what we needed, kind of brought him along. And then I was also, my eyes were like really open to the kinds of struggles that especially rural counties have, like actually providing basic services to their residents. And like, that's really important. And so like that interchange kind of solidified a bond. But, you know, Paul's starting to hear from a bunch of different counties now that are like, hey, the income that we're going to get from logging these legacy forests, like, isn't, I mean, it's important, but we can figure it out. And like, please advocate on our behalf that we don't want to see these cut, or we want to come up with our own management plan. And so now Paul's got, he sometimes talks to me about how interesting his job is of balancing a set of counties that don't want these forests harvested versus the ones that do. But just the sea change and the fact that, I mean, he was really instrumental in sort of brokering the deal that allowed for the budget provisos in both 2023 and 2024. And he got a lot of crap from it, from, you know, his sort of more traditional county constituents, or, you know, constituents from county commissions. But he's like, you know, I don't just serve one constituent, I have to listen to everybody. So the point being that if you can work with your county commission, and then they can transmit that up the line, both to DNR and through their political arm, which is essentially WASAC, then there's more of a chance to make change. Yeah, so take care of yourself, get involved with your county, and look for solutions that that like lift all boats.
Thank you. I think it's really helpful to know that there are lots of bipartisan, nonpartisan conversations going on around the issues that we're also passionate about. So thank you for your time tonight, and thank you for answering everyone's questions. I hope I've done justice to the chat. It was a bit hard to track occasionally. But I appreciate everyone's interest and passion, and thank you for being here, Paula, and to Kate and to Marty for helping to organize.
Yeah, I want to thank you as well, so much, Paula, for taking some time to help us understand these issues, and also for your work for many years, and on all these ongoing opportunities right now as things change, and hopefully the community will continue to learn and understand the issues and speak up in their local legislative authorities and on up to the state, and be advocate, help our county commissions and county councils to be our allies in in working with DNR in managing, hopefully in concert with them. We look forward to learning more from you about what's going to be coming up in the legislature. Would it be, there are messages I'm going to save the chat, and I invite people to email me with other questions if I can forward those to you, or would you rather people just forward them to you? Or I'm happy to forward them to you.
If you can collate and forward them to me, that would be great. That would be really helpful. But I want to thank all of you for showing up and for being engaged on these issues. I know some of you have been involved in forest activism for a really long time, and for those of you that are newer to it but interested, it's it's meaningful that that you care and you're learning and you're engaged. So don't lose hope, and keep it up. So thank you. Thanks for your attention and good questions.
All right, and I'm going to put my email in the chat for anybody who would like to send further questions to me, and I will follow up with you. So thanks everybody for coming, and for your attention and your interest in this really important topic. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.